Hey everyone, it's Mike here, and in today's video, we are going to talk about how my corals have died. Actually, they're doing just fine. But in today's video, what I want to share with you are some of the lessons from all the different mistakes that I've made in the past. So if you're here and you're enjoying the content, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us. Please leave a like and a subscribe if you're really liking the content. I'm putting out videos every single week, and I hope today's video is going to add to a little bit of your knowledge and a little bit of the conversation on how we keep our corals healthy, but also the different ways we can avoid killing them. All right, everyone, let's hop behind the camera and let's take a look. All right, so here we are behind the camera. I thought I'd just give you a bit of an alternative angle today, just to see what the aquascape is like from this side. So one of the things I've been thinking about is online, you see a lot of videos on how to keep specific corals happy and healthy, and how we can adjust our aquarium conditions or feed them in a different way to ensure that they are happy. Well, one of the things I wanted to share with you based on my experience is how some of these corals show signs of mortality, how some of them actually die or get worse over time. This comes from, of course, keeping corals and hundreds of corals over the years. And for anyone out there who's owned a reef tank and purchased more than a dozen corals, you will at some stage in your reef keeping time experience some level of coral death. And I hope as we go around this aquarium here, you can learn from my lessons and hopefully avoid the death in your tank. All right, everyone, 3 ways that a Euphyllia can die. So we like to keep our aquariums extremely clean, but unfortunately, where these Euphyllias are found do not match the aquarium conditions that we have. Out in the wild, they have plenty of silt, plenty of nutrients flowing from rivers. They also have plenty of food that exists in the water. And so 0.03 ppm of phosphates or even lower than that just doesn't result in a happy and healthy hammer. So what happens when the phosphates bottom out to 0? In the past, I've noticed you will get tissue recession. So the tissue at the base of the coral will start to peel and flap upwards, and unfortunately, if it goes too far, you will get polyp bailout, and that's the polyp just ditching the skeleton and floating around the tank, and at that stage, it's not going to survive. The next way that these corals can die is, of course, through stinging, and these Euphyllias, whilst they have the same name, Euphyllia, are not always happy with each other. I have noticed torches from Queensland do not like torches from Western Australia. And I imagine if you're overseas, torches from Australia may not necessarily like torches from Indonesia. So what happens when they get stung? Sometimes the tissue starts to recede back, and the second thing that happens is they get brown jelly disease, and that's always a really ugly way to die, because brown jelly disease is going to kill that polyp but potentially spread to some of the other polyps in the colony. There are, of course, different ways that you can treat brown jelly disease, either by using ChemiClean or some sort of antiseptic antibiotic, or there are, of course, the most obvious way is just to amputate, to cut off that coral polyp and to ditch it and get rid of it. Third way that we see them dying is super high light. If you put a Euphyllia, especially an Australian gold torch, so if you've got an Australian gold torch, which comes from really muddy, silty waters surrounded by seaweed, and you put them into crystal clear water that's blasting down 300 U-mol/par, chances are you are going to see it bleach. And what happens when you notice bleaching is the coral will start to pull in on itself and it will spit out a little bit of slime. Now, don't be alarmed, sometimes that is coral poop, but every once in a while you'll notice these black threads come out of the coral mouth, and if you see the tissue around it getting lighter, chances are that's Zoes and it's not having a good time. So that's 3 ways that you can see and spot a Euphyllia not having a good time. All right, let's move on to the next coral. Alrighty, Scullies and Trackies. Yes, unfortunately, I have lost some Scullies and Trackies in the past, and they were some of my favorite corals. So the first way that these corals end up dying is because we simply don't feed them. If you don't feed your trackies or your scullies physically with a little pipette by actually placing food into its mouth, then over time, it's probably not going to get the nutritional requirements it needs. What you'll start to notice is, again, just like euphilia, the tissue will recede and pull up over the skeleton. So as soon as you start to see that, it's not going to have a good time. The second way we end up killing these corals, of course, is through ultra high light. If you think about trackies especially, they like light that is under 150 U-mols of par. And I found that trackies tend to be happiest in low light. That's when they're ultra puffy. So place them in the shade, place them in dappled light in an overhang area, and you'll find that they'll be okay. Now, if you've just got one of these things in a brand new aquarium like I did, chances are you may find that the water will not provide the nutrients that it needs. My advice is take it out of your aquarium, keep it at the LFS for a while, or lend it to a friend who's got an established system that has thriving trackies as well. So that's trackies and scullies and how I've seen them die in the past. Next coral is your SPS, that's your small polyp stony corals, and there are so many different ways that this coral can die, but I'm going to share with you my personal experience on that. So the first way that I've seen these corals die in my system is through disease. Unfortunately, some of them do bring in diseases, and I've experienced a disease that affects Australian tenuous corals. So if you've ever had that before, one way you can prevent it, of course, is by dipping it in witch hazel, and that seems to prevent the coral from dying. The second way that I've seen these corals die is, of course, when you buy them, they may sometimes be receding and have STN. So a good way to prevent your corals from dying if you see STN is just to cut the base or cut the area that is affected, and hopefully the rest of the coral colony will survive. The third way that I've seen these corals die, of course, is through stinging. And so what will happen is, if you've got a branch that's touching another branch and over time it starts to sting each other, you're better off just trimming it right away before it gets a chance to combat. Now, I know some people out there like to see the battle and like to see it happen, but from my experience, tip warfare, so that's when the branches touch the tip of the branches, is a lot more toxic than base warfare. So if you find yourself watching that happen over time, chances are it's a very slow race to the death for one of those colonies. So that's SPS corals and how I've seen them die in my system in the past. Let's talk about anemones. So how do these things die? My goodness. Well, one of the most common ways that I've seen this guy die in the past is anemones are strange creatures and they like to crawl around. So what they'll do is sometimes they will puff up, detach from their rock, and fly straight into your wave maker. So my advice for preventing that is getting some sort of guard for your wave maker so that doesn't happen. Another way that I've seen anemones die before is they will sometimes shrivel up, crawl or detach themselves off the rock and float around the aquarium into a hole or a dark cave and just never come out. And sometimes you might see them emerge and they're pasty white and pale, and hopefully they will get better. But unfortunately, sometimes they just disappear. Alrighty, the final set of corals I'd like to talk about are Zoes. And of course, Zoes to me have always been indestructible. There's actually not much in the aquarium that you can do in terms of parameters to kill them. They will thrive. But one way that I've seen them die in my system is simply fighting each other. If you keep Zoes in a system where they are next to each other or on the same frag plug or rock, they will tend to fight each other, and the strongest ones will become the most dominant color. Now, that's just nature, and at the end of the day, you'll find that will occur in a situation where space is limited. So make sure you give them plenty of space if you're planting individual Zoa types amongst each other, or give them their entire own rock just as I have here. And of course, these things, because they're so indestructible, can end up taking over an entire system. So just keep them on their own island on the sand away from the rest of the aquascape. Otherwise, they can become a threat to the rest of your inhabitants, especially SPS corals as well. So that's Zoes and how I've experienced them dying in the past. Alrighty everyone, so there you have it. That's how I have personally observed corals dying in my reef aquariums in the past. It comes as no surprise that even in this new setup here, some corals have perished. I've lost some trackies, I've lost some SPS colonies, and these things happen. Disease occurs, or sometimes the conditions just aren't right for them. So I want to leave off with this final thought. Yes, I know coral death is something that sucks, and sometimes we feel the pain of it. But sometimes you have to realize that corals are constantly fighting each other in nature. Nature has a way of failing and prevailing as well. And so when we have our corals in our tank thriving and happy and healthy, be proud of that. And when they are dying, sometimes we have to accept that that's just a part of nature as well. It's not a good thing to say, really, because ultimately every single one of us wants to keep these corals in their best condition. But I want you to realize this. Every successful reef keeper out there has a skeleton closet. Every single successful reefer out there who has walked the long path has walked on crushed corals along the way. It's just the way that nature works. So if you're in this hobby and you're noticing things go bad, here are 3 things that you can do to really quickly fix it. The first thing is, of course, get an ICP test. It's a good way of checking your water, checking your salt, or checking the parameters of your aquarium, and at least getting a gauge as to what's either contaminating your water or what's actually a deficit in your water as well. The second thing that you can do is a water change. Sometimes it's good just to reset that system back to those natural seawater levels in case you've got a contamination as well. Unless, of course, your salt batch is bad. Now, that probably requires the ICP. The third thing is making sure that you continue to feed your aquarium, continue to ensure that the corals aren't stinging each other, continue to ensure that you are making the corals happy by monitoring them closely. Those things, hopefully, will enable you to have a successful reef tank. All right, everyone, if you enjoyed this video, I would like for you, of course, to leave a comment below. What's something that you've experienced die in your tank and what was the cause of it? These things happen, unfortunately, to the best of us. It could be something that fell off a frag plug and then onto a coral and stung something else, or it could be something based on what you've done. But by sharing our experiences, hopefully we can all get better. All right, everyone, please leave a like and a subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers, everybody.